Okay, the title of this explainer might make you do a double take. And honestly, that's kind of the whole point. We're diving into a really fascinating and, yeah, provocatively named cultural trend, raw-dogging boredom.
So what exactly is it? Well, on the one hand, the act itself is incredibly simple, almost meditative. You just sit quietly, intentionally, for about 10 to 15 minutes. No phone, no music, no distractions. But the name? Whoa. It's borrowed from some seriously aggressive slang, implying risk, danger, and total exposure. This clash? It's not a mistake. It's the entire key to understanding what's going on here.
And that, of course, leads to the big question, right? Why on earth would a generation pick such a jarring, intense name for what is essentially a mindfulness practice? The answer tells us a whole lot about the world we're living in and the pressures we're all under. See, you gotta understand, this isn't being framed as passive meditation. It's not about finding your Zen. It's being positioned as an active, conscious act of rebellion, a fight against the digital noise that so many feel is just completely taking over their lives.
This whole trend is a direct response, a kind of self-correction, coming from a generation that grew up completely saturated in digital chaos. They're dealing with digital burnout, constant anxiety, and decision fatigue. So this is their way of yanking the emergency brake and trying to carve out some mental space for themselves.
So to really get the rebellion, you have to understand what they're rebelling against. And it's a very real, quantifiable crisis in our basic ability to just pay attention.
I mean, just look at these numbers. They are staggering. Back in 2004, the average attention span on a screen was 2.5 minutes. By 2012, that had plummeted to 75 seconds. And today, it's a mere 47 seconds. Our collective ability to focus is literally evaporating before our eyes.
And think about what that means. When your brain has been trained for these tiny 47-second bursts of stimulation, sitting in total silence for 15 minutes, that's not relaxing. That's a mental marathon. It's a hardcore workout for your focus muscle, and that is exactly why they're doing it. So what's actually going on in our brains? It pretty much comes down to something called the dopamine baseline theory. All our apps, our feeds, they're designed to give us constant, tiny hits of dopamine, that pleasure chemical. Over time, this raises our brain's tolerance, its pleasure threshold. It makes normal, quiet, low-reward activities, like reading a book or just thinking, feel incredibly dull by comparison.
This table just lays it all out so clearly. On the left, you've got the conditions, the attention crisis, feeling stuck mentally, avoiding the big questions. These are all driven by digital behaviors, like endless scrolling, which mess with our dopamine and shut down our brain's creative side. And on the right, raw-dogging boredom is the therapeutic response to each one. It's about building endurance, letting your mind wander, and forcing that deep thinking we usually scroll away from.
But here's where it gets really interesting. What if boredom itself isn't the bad guy we've made it out to be? What if it's actually a good thing? The science here completely reframes the whole experience.
This is such a powerful idea. We are all taught to see boredom as a void, this awful, empty space that we have to fill immediately. But neuroscience is showing us it's more like a check engine light. It's a signal from your brain saying, hey, I'm done with this, I'm ready to switch gears and fire up my creative networks.
So how does it actually work? Well, when you finally stop pumping your brain full of stimulus, your cognitive filters start to relax. That allows your brain's default mode network, which is basically the hub for imagination and deep thought, to kick into high gear. Your mind starts to wander, connecting old ideas in new ways. And boom, that's the sweet spot where creativity and new ideas are born.
Now, let's be real. This doesn't always feel like a walk in the park. As this quote gets at, when you strip away all the distractions, it can get really uncomfortable. You're forced to confront all the thoughts and feelings you've been avoiding. But that forced introspection, that mental check-in, that's a crucial part of the whole deal. So if the practice is so good for you, why the aggressive, ironic name? This is where we get into the sociology of it all. The irony isn't just for laughs, it's a kind of psychological armor. This whole practice fits into a much bigger trend of digital minimalism. You're seeing flip phones, wired headphones making a comeback. And for Gen Z, these aren't just retro fashion choices. They are public statements of self-preservation. It's a way of performing an identity that says, I value my mental health more than the convenience that big tech is selling me. And this is why the language is so brilliant. Calling it mindfulness or meditation can feel a bit earnest, maybe a little vulnerable. But when you reframe it as raw-dogging boredom, you turn it into a gritty, defiant challenge. You make an act of self-care sound like an extreme sport. And that is absolutely the goal. The language flips a quiet retreat into what this source calls an assertive display of resilience and fortitude. It's a clever way to signal strength, not weakness, in a culture that still really values toughness.
What's pretty mind-blowing is that this very modern, very online trend has these incredibly deep philosophical roots. I'm talking about thinkers like Kierkegaard and Heidegger, who argued that you have to confront boredom head-on, without distractions, if you ever want to find your authentic self. This generation is essentially engaging in that same profound exercise, whether they know it or not.
So what's the bigger impact here? This isn't just a meme that's going to fade away. This grassroots movement is actually starting to have some pretty significant real-world consequences for all of us.
First, you gotta appreciate the beautiful paradox at the heart of it. For an anti-screen movement to go viral, it has to be performed on screens. People are literally filming themselves doing nothing so they can post it on TikTok. But that contradiction is actually what fuels the conversation and keeps the idea spreading through the algorithm.
And this is where it gets really powerful. This cultural feeling is now being backed up by actual policy. When a state like California mandates that schools have to limit smartphone use, that's the system finally catching up to what individuals have been saying. The personal timeout is becoming an official, society-wide strategy. So to wrap it all up, Rawdogging Boredom is so much more than a funny name. It's a brilliantly packaged rebellion. It's a sophisticated cultural countersignal that uses irony as a weapon in the fight for something that's becoming increasingly rare and precious: our own cognitive freedom.
Which leaves us all with a pretty big question to chew on. In a world that is so desperate for every last second of our focus, that simply doing nothing has become an act of defiance, what exactly is our attention truly worth fighting for?